this isn't quite so cutting edge anymore. But I'll let you judge for that. It's a real honor to be chosen as a Dorothy Tarrant speaker, and I'll be talking a little bit about Dorothy Tarrant partway into my lecture. It's a particular honor to have been chosen the same year as my friend Joshua Katz, who will be speaking in May. I'll definitely be here. That will be a great lecture. As for this lecture, let me just say, it represents an experiment for me. As Greg said, my past research has been on fairly, am I speaking loudly enough?
Yes.
Okay. On fairly broad topics in Roman cultural history, such as political humor, body movement and gesture, and recently how speaking a language that has grammatical gender changes the way you look at the world around you. But deep in the heart of most classical philologists, and I'm afraid we can't deny it, is the desire to write a commentary on an ancient text. And even though I thought I was prepared to take this on, the task has been proving far more of a challenge than I expected. In particular, I find I'm developing a schizophrenic mental state that requires keeping in mind the text's broader issues while I'm looking at the minutiae of syntax, grammatical gender, legal problems, prose rhythm, as I work my way through 7,531 words of Latin. Not that I'm counting. But what I want to do this evening is to unite these two sets of micro and macro concern. I'll start by reviewing the largely historical questions that are raised by the literary work that's been occupying my time. Namely, what do earthquakes have to do with Etruscan priests and Roman politics? Or why are these guys here in the funny hats involved with the toegate proceedings of the Roman Senate? I'll then move on to some specific, actually 3 specific philological issues raised in the text, particularly concerning syntax and sound effects, to show how the author, Cicero, uses these apparently tangential oddities to reinforce larger points about the speech. So there will be Latin in this talk, but I'm assured that what I have to say is perfectly understandable to the Latinless or the Latin little. Again, as Greg said, I'm teaming up with this project with Andrew Rigsby of the University of Texas at Austin. And while Andrew is still in Texas, we're collaborating via the magic that is Google Docs. Now, Andrew is a fellow part-time Ciceronian. Our focuses diverge, though. He's more interested in issues of law and rhetoric, whereas I'm more interested in issues of language, style, and religion. So I think we make a really good team. We chose as our text a speech from 56 BC entitled De haruspicum responsis. Difficult to translate, something on the responses of the Etruscan priests. And 2 principal considerations drove us to choose this speech. The first is that except for a commentary from 1969 that discusses pretty much exclusively historical issues, there has never been a comprehensive treatment of this oration. Now, there are a couple reasons for this neglect. One is not because it's not interesting, so don't leave. One is that the historical references are oblique, and the language is particularly contorted, even by Ciceronian standards. And in this sense, it fits speeches that he delivered after his exile, of which this is one. But to give a flavor, let me quote one sentence. This is just so I'm not prejudicing it. It's from a translation by someone else in English, unaltered by me, and it renders one of Cicero's Latin sentences. The strenuous, concerted, and unanimous opposition and resistance which had been offered in the previous year by Claudius's cousin Metellus, and by a Senate which was even then united, and which was supported by a speech which Gnaeus Pompeius, leader of the Senate, delivered, was, after the split among the nobles, which is what we're now being warned against, so utterly disintegrated and altered that what Claudius's cousin, when consul, had striven to prevent, and what his distinguished kinsman and comrade, who had not approved that he should be put on trial, had opposed, was, during the feud between our leaders, brought about by that consul, who might have been expected to be Claudius's worst foe, while he also said that the authority upon which he had acted was such that none could be dissatisfied with it. Trust me, it's more compelling and interesting in the Latin. I hate reading Cicero in translation. A second and probably more compelling reason for the centuries of neglect of this speech is the weight of scholarly tradition. And this topic offers me the pleasant opportunity for a short digression. I have the honor this evening of delivering a lecture named after Dorothy Tarrant, and so it's appropriate that my Ciceronian speech has suffered because of a type of analysis in which she specialized. Professor Tarrant is probably best known for her book on the Hippias Maior, where she analyzed in detail the style of this Greek dialogue in an attempt to prove that it was not, in fact, written by Plato. Now, I don't dare enter into an opinion on this controversy, but I think it's fair to say that once the question of authorship rears its head, and classicists being the type of people that they are, the bulk of scholarship on Hippias Maior, at least until recently, continues to focus on authenticity. So what does this have to do with Cicero's De haruspicum responsis? Well, over 370 years ago, in 1745, a classic scholar from Cambridge named Jeremiah Markland argued in an appendix to a larger work that this speech, along with some other post-redative speeches, was a forgery. Markland's theory would likely have been forgotten had it not been for the efforts 50 years later of the preeminent German classicist of his day, Friedrich Wolff. Wolff is well known among classicists even today for his Prolegomena to Homer of 1795, in which he was the first scholar to argue systematically that the Homeric epics were composed orally and committed to writing only several centuries later. Cutting edge. 6 years after publishing this masterwork, Wolff produced a set of commentaries on Cicero, devoted exclusively to supporting in detail Markland's points that the De haruspicum responsis and these other speeches is a forgery. Now, although the discovery of better manuscripts and the study of Ciceronian prose rhythm, about which I'll talk later, had vitiated the majority of Markland's and Wolff's arguments, and no Ciceronian scholar today that I know of doubts that these speeches were written by Cicero, still they suffer from scholarly neglect. And yet, I should add that Wolff's detailed commentary has proven quite useful for me, actually much like from when I've read Dr. Tarrant's book on Hippias Maior has, since his zeal to point out those many elements that he sees as obvious evidence for non-Ciceronian authorship helps me isolate several passages that are, in fact, very peculiar and worthy of comment. So, following this, my own Prolegomena ad Ciceronem, I now turn at last to a brief summary of the content of the speech. I don't even expect that most Ciceronians know what this speech is about, so I hope I'm not condescending, because I want to demonstrate that it's worthy of serious attention. I'll then sketch out some of the highlights of my research, some of the particulars. There are three main actors in the speech. Cicero, here in a contemporary portrait, the haruspices, a group of Etruscan priests, represented here by bronze statuettes from about 2 centuries or 3 centuries before the speech was delivered. And finally, Cicero's principal political opponent, Publius Clodius Pulcher, also known as Claudius. No ancient images survive of Claudius, so I represent him here by the actor currently playing Claudius in Stratford in the 7-hour stage adaptation to Robert Harris's trilogy on Cicero. We saw part 1 in December, I think. It is phenomenal. We couldn't get tickets for part 2 until this morning. So, we're seeing part 2 on Saturday. Anyway, I strongly recommend it. He's a great Claudius. If Claudius can be great. Sorry, Cicero. Okay, back to the topic at hand. It was Claudius, this guy, or the guy this guy represents, who, as tribune of the people, had engineered Cicero's exile in 58 BC. And this is on your handout. 58 BC, 2 years before this speech was delivered. In late summer of 57, in what he came to regard as a major moral victory, Cicero returned from exile after having been recalled by votes of the Senate and of the Roman people. But while Cicero was in the east, Claudius had seized Cicero's property on Rome's Palatine Hill, torn down his house, and consecrated on the site a shrine to liberty, Libertas. Pretty obvious what the symbolism is. Now that Rome has been freed of the tyrannical Cicero, we have freedom once again. More devious is the consequence of Claudius building this shrine. When Cicero returned from exile, he couldn't immediately reclaim his property since it was now sanctified ground, which is, of course, what Claudius intended. This issue was soon resolved. in fall of 57, a panel of Roman priests, the pontifices, and please remember the pontifices, and we'll talk about them in a second, they deemed that Claudius's consecration had been invalid and that therefore Cicero could regain possession of his property. Cicero seemed well on his way to regaining the stature that he had had before exile, and he acts like he is. But then, late spring, 56, year of I actually didn't do that. This natural event would produce major political aftershocks. Most importantly, it would pit Claudius against Cicero in a struggle over what that sound meant. Now, those of you who've done even a cursory reading of the historians of ancient Rome will recall that during the Roman Republic, any incident marked by an unnatural event occurring in nature, from a talking cow to a hermaphrodite to raining blood to an earth tremor coming out of a computer, is deemed by the Romans a prodigium, a prodigy. A Roman prodigy during the Republican period, though, wasn't just an unusual event, but it was one having potentially serious cultural and religious consequences. The occurrence of prodigies signaled an awareness of an unspecific rupture, and the unspecific is important because that's why the Senate is going to be debating in the Deus Responsis. So a prodigy signaled an awareness of an unspecific rupture of order in the natural world, a violation of which is designated in Latin as the pax deorum. Now this term pax deorum, which means literally the peace of the gods, really has the underlying idea that resembles the modern Gaia hypothesis, according to which all living organisms and inert matter in the universe, and for the Romans, moral behavior, all interact as a single synergetic system. As a result of the prodigy's cosmic significance, any potential occurrence demands authentication. Not surprisingly, prodigies tend to proliferate in times of political crisis, such as during the invasion of Italy by Hannibal and the Carthaginians in the Second Punic War, or in the years of civil unrest at the beginning of the first century BCE. But what perhaps is surprising is that in the process of investigating, validating, and eventually expiating a prodigy, it's the Roman Senate as a group that monitors each individual step. And yet, despite the hundreds of allusions to prodigies in texts from this period, only one source provides insight into the actual workings of this senatorial process. Yep, that text is Cicero's speech before the Senate, entitled Deus Responsis. So you can see the speech is important and unique in three ways. First, it allows us to reconstruct in better details the initial steps taken by the Senate when informed of a potential prodigy. Second, it offers the full text of a response created by a priestly body that explains to the Senate what the prodigy may portend. Third, and most vividly, it preserves the parameters of the kinds of debate that would have taken place in order to determine how the Senate, and therefore the Roman state, should respond to this latest instance of divine intervention. Now, even though not a single text provides all the details, it's nevertheless possible to reconstruct from our various sources how a prodigy is treated from the moment of its occurrence to its official recognition and expiation. To begin with, once a prodigy was deemed worthy of consideration by the Senate, that body would normally request a report from one of three priestly groups, sometimes from two. For the reasons informing their choice of which group on each occasion is normally a guessing matter. In this particular case, two of the three groups wouldn't have been practical. The Roman College of Pontifices, as we just saw in the PowerPoint, and see here actually, could not be asked its opinion, since it was this group that a few months earlier, in the previous September, had decided a related issue of Cicero's house. The second group, the so-called quindecim viri, or the 15 men in charge of sacred stuff, were also not able to be considered, since one of their members, Publius Clodius, was a main player in the events. This left the third remaining group, the Etruscan haruspices, a band of priests whose membership requires descent from an elite Etruscan family and years of disciplined training. Unlike the members of the two Roman colleges, these public haruspices seem not to have had political significance, other than their role in prodigies. In the course of the speech, for example, Cicero provides the full name of 13 of the 15 current members of the Roman Pontifical College, of the Pontificates, the majority of whom were also senators. The two he doesn't name are Julius Caesar, who's not in Rome at the time, we don't know where he is, and a guy named Lucius Pinarius Nata, who voted against Cicero in September. So, but Cicero has no qualms about naming and actually talking about the 13 other priests. By contrast, Cicero speaks of the haruspices, upon whose judgment his entire argument rests, as an undifferentiated group of anonymous participants. And in fact, for the entire period of the Republic, not a single public haruspix is known by name. And by public, I mean not Spurinna going, "But where's the Ides of March?" He's not in this group. So once the Senate decided that the earth tremors were worth investigating, they consulted these haruspices, who produced a response. So let me read just the beginning of that response, which is produced on the PowerPoint and handout in section 2, so you get a flavor of it. And this is quoted by Cicero at different parts of the speech. He never gives the entire thing as a body. Because a clash, accompanied by a rumbling, was heard in the Agra Latiniensis, rights are due in reparation to Jupiter, Saturn, Neptune, Tellus, who's the god of the earth, and the heavenly gods. The gods are angry because games have been performed with insufficient care and polluted, because sacred and religious places are being treated as unholy, and the haruspices give a number, about 4 other reasons that the gods are angry. And then follows a series of warnings of what will happen if reparations are not made in response to these offenses. The possible repercussions, as you can see here, include tyranny and the overthrow of the Republic. Based on what we know of Etruscan prophecy, it seems likely that these clauses were drawn individually from old Etruscan books of divination, combined into a single response, and then translated into Latin. The Etruscan books on haruspicy no longer survive, but a 6th century AD Greek translation of a 1st century BC Latin translation of an Etruscan original of God knows when does survive, of a brontoscopic calendar. That is, an interpretive guide concerning the consequences attendant upon the incidence of thunder or lightning on any given day during the year. So if lightning strikes in Kentish Town, where I live, on January 24th, this is what it means. The parallels between this text, as far as we can tell from it being a Greek translation of a Latin translation of an Etruscan text, and that of the haruspices here are striking enough for me to consider Cicero's version of the response on the PowerPoint to represent the real thing. To cite just one example, one of the reasons that the Etruscan priests of 56 offer to convince the Senate to expiate the prodigy is so that, to quote the passages underlined and in bold on the PowerPoint, so that elders and leaders might not meet with murder and danger on account of discordant quarreling, with the result that the state passes into the rule of one man. Compare this prophecy with the wording of the entry from the thunder calendar at 2 on the PowerPoint. If there's thunder on September 25th, we're warned, out of civil unrest, a tyrant shall be raised up, but the powerful will be destroyed utterly. So while the similarities between these passages aren't exact, they do, to my mind, seem to arise from analogous concerns. And there are other parallels that are not quite as exact. But to return to the response preserved by Cicero, I'd like to highlight 2 of the several remarkable features of this text. The first is that the response does not affect a specific resolution. On the contrary, the 3 portions of the text, first, A, a prescription for how to expiate the prodigy, B, the reason the gods are angry, and C, what will happen if the gods are not appeased. All 3 of these sections make clear that the response is an open text, one that is available for both logical analysis and rhetorical elaboration. It's up to the Senate, in other words, to determine precisely who roused the gods' anger. Second, I'd like to note that many, if not most of the clauses in the response, on an objective reading, point to Cicero as being the source of the divine commotion, which actually intuitively makes sense. In particular, the second clause in bold, the gods are angry because sacred and religious places are being treated as unholy. This is difficult to construe as referring to anything else during this period other than Cicero's reclamation of his property, here reasonably deemed as violating religious propriety. To support this assumption that this is is aimed at Cicero, not saying that it was intentionally made that way, but that it looks like Cicero himself attests that this was the clause in the response that prompted the Senate to ask the consuls to bring the response forward for deliberation in the first place. We know that they could have received the response, looked at it, and said, forget it, we're not going to consider it. But Cicero tells us that it's this clause that caused the Senate to want to deliberate more about it. We also know that on the day before Cicero delivered his own speech, Claudius argued precisely this point about that clause in front of the Roman people who were assembled before the Senate House. And then finally, in a classic example of protesting a little too much, Cicero devotes more than 1/4 of the speech in an attempt to rebut this single clause. But, in spite of this seemingly damning praise, Cicero won the case and retained ownership of his property. So this quick summary shows that one of the overarching themes of our commentary will be an assessment of Cicero's rhetorical strategy in convincing the Senate that his is the correct way of reading the will of the gods, as it is made manifest in the tremors on the earth, and it is channeled to humans through Etruscan divinatory texts. In particular, we'll critique the claim that Roman religion consisted of a group of Hellenized, educated skeptics who manipulated people's gullibility in order to maintain ascendancy. In fact, in this speech, Cicero critiques this very claim. He argues that his own philosophical sophistication has made him appreciate more, rather than less, the inherent structure of the Roman religious system. So this jaded view of Roman religion also comes under question in light of the various factors involved here, such as the participation of the haruspices, an apparently objective group of priests, the production of a priestly response that seems to accuse Cicero, and a reasoned argument by Cicero exclusively before the Senate that guides its members through a critical reading. But rather than dwell on these general considerations, I want to now turn to specific issues from our commentary so you can see what I've really been doing here for the past couple of months. I've intentionally chosen notes that encompass 3 different areas in an attempt to cover the variety of approaches that we've adopted. But I also hope to show how a closer analysis of the Latin text can shed light on these larger issues. So those areas are Roman law. I shiver when I say Roman law, so if there's a Roman law expert out there, I welcome the place. Second, Latin prose rhythm as a tool for textual emendation. And then finally, how euphony, the very sound of the speech, contributes to Cicero's larger goals. And I should add that this is very much a work in progress, so any comments, critiques are welcome. So I'll start with the second sentence of the text, and a legal problem that I think is probably insoluble. Even so, it's clear how it contributes to Cicero's persuasive abilities. Now, in the opening portion of a forensic or a deliberative speech, this I guess would be deliberative if you wanted to label it, both Greek and Roman rhetorical treatises normally prescribe that the speaker should simply introduce the subject at hand, make clear his stance on that subject, and ingratiate himself with the audience. But since in this instance, Cicero's audience of senators knew in advance that he'd be interpreting their response, he has no reason to summarize the situation. And since the senators likely already hate or love Cicero, there's little point in trying to gain their favor, at least openly. The alternative that Cicero adopts at the beginning of the speech is strange. He doesn't mention the response and its attendant prodigy. He doesn't mention the reason that the senators are sitting there or standing there until well over 1/8 of the way into the speech. Instead, he describes a Senate meeting of the previous day so that he can portray Claudius as a crazed lunatic, one guilty of incest with his sisters, whose principal contact with issues in Roman religion occurred on a December evening 6 years earlier when he cross-dressed to penetrate a festival restricted to women, and to meet his mistress, allegedly Julius Caesar's wife. Amidst this flurry of invective, Cicero reveals how on the previous day he had checked the rampaging Claudius. In doing so, he sets up a clear contrast between Claudius and himself concerning who has the greater mastery of language. Here's the second sentence of the speech in English. It's a lot shorter than the other one, you can see. So, I checked his riotous rage as soon as I threatened legal proceedings. With 2 words begun, duobus inceptis verbis, I stifled entirely the ferocious onslaught of this gladiator. That's Claudius. In other words, 2 words referring to some type of legal action silenced the crazed Claudius. Undoubtedly, Cicero's audience of senators understood the reference. After all, most of them would have been in the Senate the previous day. But we weren't, and we don't. Clearly, this needs a note. I'll pass over quickly now what I argue in the commentary, which is actually, if you're into antiquarianism, is really interesting. I assume that this phrase is to be taken literally, and that the ablative absolute construction here, duobus inceptis verbis, means having started to say the 2 words. That is, Cicero spoke a recognizable 2-word formula. But which 2 words? 3 possibilities. The first is that Cicero shouted, "Publius Clodius!" That is, he spoke Claudius's name. There is indeed a legal procedure called the nominis delatio, by which an accuser brings a person's name before a Roman judge, in this case the praetor, to initiate a trial. Nevertheless, it's unclear what role the name of the accused actually plays in initiating the process. Whether somebody just meets somebody on the street and says their name, probably not. But whatever may be the procedural technicalities, context also makes this interpretation unlikely. Since how would you imagine Claudius, in a frantic state no less, to have interpreted an intention on Cicero's part to commence litigation simply on the basis of hearing the orator utter his name? A second suggestion raises similar problems. In referring back to this same episode later in the speech, Cicero remarks, "Atagi leg initiudici." Literally, I touched on the beginning of laws and of a trial. From this allusion, some have suggested that Cicero's 2 words were the beginning of a law by which he hoped to prosecute Claudius, the most likely option being a law on public violence, or vis. This does seem possible, but it's unclear then what are the 2 specific words to which Cicero refers. It seems more natural to me to take the phrase legnitium et judici as a simple endiates, meaning I touched on the beginning of legal proceedings, for which there are parallels elsewhere in Cicero. So at this point, pending what my partner Andrew, who after all is the legal scholar, thinks about it, I propose a third option, namely that Cicero has begun the customary process of a formal in use vocatio, that is, a summoning of another person to trial. Variations of the oral formula used in this procedure occur throughout Latin of the Republican era. One of the most tantalizing parallels for understanding the Ciceronian passage is in a scene from the 2nd century comic playwright Plautus, in which one character threatens another by saying, "In use voco te," literally, "Into court I call you." When the person addressed in the play refuses, he's subject to physical violence to try to take him to court. On balance, it seems likely to me that Cicero said to Claudius something like what the Plautine character said, "In use voco," you also have "in use ambula," "go to court with me," whose legal significance would have been unambiguous even to a crazed criminal like Claudius. The note continues by addressing other issues, one of which I'm fascinated with, even though there's no bearing on this particular instance, and that is whether the Romans considered prepositions to be words. It seems like they didn't, in which case he didn't say in use, he said in use voco or in use ambula. But regardless of what exactly Cicero is doing here on the legal level, this conflict also has a meta level. Immediately before presenting an account of how to rationalize a prodigy, he prepares his audience of senators for his own side of the argument. When reason and violence clash, reason wins out. In contrast with Claudius's irrationality, which rages like the tremors in the earth, we have the calm that Cicero is able to evoke with just words, with just 2 words. The speech also contains interesting exploitations of sound at the non-verbal level. The Etruscan priests, in their written response to the recent prodigy, described that prodigy as follows. Auditus est strepitus cum fremitu. Heard was a rumbling along with trembling. The juxtaposition seen here of the consonant cluster st is avoided throughout all genres of classical Latin. It never occurs in Virgil. The poet Catullus uses it only once, apparently to capture the dull stupidity of an enemy. Gallus homo est stultus. Gallus, the guy, stupid. In prose, there's a similar avoidance. In the 34 extant books of the historian Livy, relevant instances appear only 3 times. In Cicero's 58 extant orations, there are 5 occurrences, but 3 occur in this speech to describe the prodigy. The suspicion that this combination was considered cacophonous and unnatural is further indicated by the fact that roughly 1/4 of the occurrences of this combination in the works of Cicero outside his orations occur in the same context of Catullus's, to describe someone or some idea as stupid. Clearly, to me clearly, the text here is intended to imitate the unnatural sound of the earth tremors by employing a combination of sounds deemed unnatural in Latin. Note too that the sequence causes an unavoidable hiatus, a gap between the 2 occurrences of st, which also mimetically produces an effect of the words being separated. Finally, the oddness is further reinforced by the triple repetition of etu, auditus, strepitus, fremitu. Homoeoptolatin of this sort is studiously avoided in formal Latin. But we can't stop here. What requires further thought is the fact, and this, I have to admit, this only occurred to me after working on this for a couple of days. This marked instance of cacophony doesn't originate with Cicero, but with the Latin translation that he has of an Etruscan text. We have no idea what the Etruscan original would have sounded like, but I wonder if the ancient translator here is making a philosophical point that may have been in the original. Much as the natural world intrudes upon human affairs, so too does it affect human language. If this possibility sounds too abstract, I should note that a primary contender for the Latin translator of this response is a 1st century scholar named Nigidius Figulus. Nigidius, we know quite a bit about Nigidius. He was a contemporary and colleague of Cicero. Cicero characterizes him in his own translation of Plato's Timaeus as, quote, a keen and careful explorer, investigator, of those things that seem hidden by nature. One intriguing example of Nigidius' explorations occurs in a treatise on grammar that he wrote, in which Nigidius posits that divine nature is actively involved in the production of human language. So our lips protrude when we say you, for example, which in Latin is vos and tu. They protrude because they're gesturing towards the person to whom they refer. He apparently wrote a whole book explaining Latin this way, which we don't have. But to somebody with a mind like that, or to any of the senators sympathetic to this possibility, it'd be appropriate to create an earth-shaking sound like auditus est strepitus cum fremitu. But I don't get speculative, so let's return to facts. It's well known how seriously Cicero paid attention to the rhythms of his sentences. In fact, his attraction to certain sequences of long and short syllables and his avoidance of others has often been used by textual scholars to amend a passage of Cicero, even if it's been both transmitted without any variation, and even if it makes perfect semantic and syntactic sense. In other words, an entirely understandable passage is amended simply because it doesn't sound good, or doesn't sound Ciceronian. Let me offer a potential example from De Haruspicum Responsis. The context here finds Cicero boasting, and that's important, on how free from religious taint is the property on which his house stands. And I'm just going to read this literal translation. Nor do I fear that this my boasting, ungrateful rather than obnoxious, may seem. This clause is perfectly acceptable in terms of content, and both its vocabulary and word order accord with expected Ciceronian standards. So what's objectionable? The rhythm of the final 5 syllables. As many of you will recognize, that sequence, which of course is underlined, ans videatur, matches the typical end of a dactylic hexameter, a meter characteristic of epic poetry in Greek and Latin, and a rhythm that, at least since Aristotle, has met with unequivocal disapproval in rhetorical treatises, including Cicero's own. The rhythms of oratorical prose should not resemble the metrical cadences of poetry. Ciceronian oratorical practice supports these theoretical assertions. The dactyl postpondi closing clausula, da-da-da-da-da, that we have here, occurs 8.5% of the time in normal Latin, whereas it occurs in fewer than 10% of Cicero's sentences. That is, 1/4 of the time we would expect. So it's clear that Cicero prefers to avoid this rhythm. Still, maybe these statistics would not warrant amending the text if it weren't for a second complicating factor. Even in antiquity, Cicero was mocked for his love of the rhythm ending esse videatur, a series of syllables that yields the attractive sequence of a resolved cretic plus espandi, da, 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 esse videatur. In contrast with the dactylic ending found in the manuscripts, in 1, Cicero uses this sequence of cretic followed by espandi twice as often as you'd naturally expect. And the percentages, as you can see, are 2.4% in normal Latin, but almost twice as often in Cicero. Since adding the infinitive form esse would not change the meaning of the sentence, it's tempting to amend the text here, even though we have no manuscript evidence. Accordingly, Tadeusz Zielinski, who pioneered the serious study of Ciceronian prose early in the 20th century, suggested that Cicero, in fact, wrote adrogans esse videatur. So what does one do in this instance? We trust the manuscripts and read the offensive sounding ans videatur, section 1, or trust statistics and amend to the more euphonic sequence of esse videatur. Well, I think there's a third option. In addition to manuscripts and statistics, one can consider semantics. I propose we keep the text as transmitted by the manuscripts, adrogans videatur, for 3 reasons. First, the use of preferred prose rhythms represents a tendency, not a hard and fast rule. If I were composing this sentence, I would definitely avoid ans videatur as dactylic, and therefore I'm told ugly, but I'm not Cicero. Second, it seems a remarkable example of kismet that the words preceding this clausula also form a dactyl, and a very un-Virgilian one at that. Poi us quadrogans videatur. Maybe this is just happenstance, but it reinforces my semantic reason for wishing to retain the original reading. Cicero not infrequently uses this epic ending to mock an opponent's way of speaking, or simply to depict an adversary in a less than flattering light. One concise example will make this clear, which has tended to go unnoticed in scholarship on the topic. In a passage from his second Philippic against Mark Antony, a passage that makes studying Cicero worthwhile and that students never forget, Cicero describes in mock grandiose detail an episode when Antony, speaking before the assembled Roman populace, displayed the inevitable consequences of a night of drunken carousal. To quote Cicero in English, while carrying out public business at an assembly of the Roman people, as master of the Roman knights for whom even a burp would be objectionable, this man Antony vomited, filling his lap and the entire tribunal with chunks of food that reeked of wine. Now, Cicero is punning here on the use of vomit, which he also uses to characterize an inappropriately messy style of speaking. And that messiness is mirrored, I would claim, in the prose rhythm. The textual tradition for the sentence that follows the one I've just quoted is split concerning how Cicero rounded off the story. It's not worth going into details, but suffice it to say that the best manuscript ends with a dactylic closure that fits the context, and I think must be read. Veniamus ad splendidiora. Let's move on now to more resplendent material. Although the majority of editors prefer to read here the word splendidiora as splendida, which would give a more acceptable rhythm, I'd argue that the inappropriate dactylic closure of splendidiora, rather than being an accident of transmission, is intended by Cicero to underscore Antony's ineptitude, not just as a statesman, but as an orator as well. So what does this have to do with the rhythm in Daedalus from responses? The clearest explanation, it seems to me, is that just as Cicero uses the dactylic rhythm to highlight the inappropriate behavior of his opponents, and there are more examples than this one, so too, I think he here turns such criticism on himself. He too speaks improperly on occasion, and Cicero stresses this through the use of rhythm. What fault is he referring to? Cicero has a reputation in antiquity, perhaps one that's well-deserved, for boasting about his achievements. And this reputation is alluded to by his contemporaries as well as by later critics. Nevertheless, it's rare for him to make explicit reference in public to this reputation as a blowhard. But he does so here. And in a gesture of calculated humility, he consciously employs an awkward rhythmical close as an example of humorous self-reproach. As he says in the sentence containing this clausula, which I give here in a more elegant English version, I have no fear that this boastfulness of mine be seen as arrogant rather than grateful. And it's the last sentence of a section where he's talking about his arrogance. So I've touched on three themes in this speech by looking in detail at three short passages from the Latin text. These were Cicero's ability to silence an opponent's crazed violence through his use of rational speech, the close correspondence between sound of nature and that of human language, and finally, the use of the rhythm of the sentence to underscore its meaning. Each short passage contributes, in turn, to Cicero's overall argument. At the beginning of the speech, the portent in the north of Latium, the written response of the Etruscan books, and the voice of the haruspices are treated as three separate categories. As the oration proceeds, Cicero takes his audience of senators through a sentence-by-sentence reading of the haruspical response, underscoring that an understanding of the rumblings in the earth and of the message of the priests requires not mystical training from Etruria, but the Roman clear-headedness of the rationality that stems from language. So what the response from the Etruscan priests achieves, an achievement that Cicero, Claudius, and the Roman Senate couldn't have effected without their help, is to introduce a new point of view into senatorial deliberations, namely the point of view of the gods. To safeguard political objectivity, the authority representing that new point of view arises not only from a foreign group, but also from a foreign process. As I mentioned earlier, Etruscan divination gave the state not a completed decision, but the backdrop for a debate that would resolve the dispute between Cicero and Claudius. A debate authorized not only by the haruspices, but as Cicero says early on in the speech, almost by the voice of Jupiter himself, who expressed his discontent through the rumblings of the earth. And what's the ultimate result of this elaborate system? The widely circulated rumors about the strange rumblings in Latium have now been resolved. A peaceful natural world has been restored, and both have come about ultimately by a decision of the Senate, a decision that rests upon the logical analysis of a Cicero. And the catalyst for this decision originated from a body that functioned within the Roman political process, while simultaneously having its undisputed origin on the outside. And that catalyst was the necessary supplement of the Etruscan haruspices. Thank you.